Maybe I've started my sermons in this way before, but I am struck with my love for the scriptures. I love the scriptures. I have read these stories time and again, or had them read to me, or engaged them, and I can't get over the richness that's in them. Here we have a text about the Hebrew people being drawn out of Egypt, Exodus meaning to be drawn out. And we know this story, and we've heard it a million times, roughly. And yet there is still so much value in hearing it again. So much that we're invited to consider about what it means to be human in this world, in relationship with a living God. There have been many, many lessons I have received from this text that have helped me in my relationship with God. And so I'm surprised that as I came into this particular Sunday, that there was still more available. The scriptures are really shaped largely in our shared experience by biblical scholarship, something that the modern era made possible in ways that previously it had not been done. We learned through the modern era that scriptures are not history per se, not in the way that we understand history, or maybe in the way that we thought we understood history. Scriptures are not a rule book of law and order. They're not authoritarian, dictating to us how we are supposed to live and go in this world. Instead, they're stories that tell of a relationship between God and God's people, starting with God's people. These scriptures are authoritative. They invite us into living a life where God is the priority. That relationship becomes central to our understanding of ourselves in this world. From biblical scholarship, which really took root and started to flourish in the mid to late 1600s, we know that the Old Testament, the Pentateuch in particular, the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, that they're comprised of 4 different authors that were writing in different periods of time, making different emphasis to the listeners. To quote from one of my commentaries, the 4 different writers were the Yahwehist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomy, and the priestly. J, D, E, and P is how it's often referred to. And I'm not going to expect you to remember this because I still have to go back to my books to remember it concisely. But what I want to flag for you is that the Yahwehist was writing during the 10th and 9th century before the Common Era. It was written either during the united monarchy of David and Solomon, which is around 1000 to 922 before the Common Era, or directly after that to the southern kingdom of Judah, shortly after the split of the north and southern kingdom of Israel. The Elohist was writing during the 8th century before the Common Era. And it was written specifically for the northern kingdom of Israel, sometime between 922 and 722 before the Common Era. The book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomist, who wrote the book of Deuteronomy, but then also had some other contributions, was written during the 7th century before the Common Era. And that was wanting to flourish in the reign of Josiah, around 621 before the Common Era. And the priestly history was written in the 6th century, in the wake of the Babylonian exile, between 587 and 539 before the Common Era. So you see, even these stories that we read about in Scripture were not written by one author in some chronological fashion, but were written over the span of time to emphasize to a chosen people who it is that they are in relationship with the living God. It's what we understand in the Gospels, that each Gospel was written with a particular audience in mind. And so it is with the Old Testament. It seems, though, however, after coming out of the modern era and its emphasis on biblical scholarship, that we had dismissed the power of story in our lives to help us make meaning of life. It seems like we're the only creatures that make meaning, and we do so in relationship to one another. We don't know of any other creatures that make meaning like humans do, although we can imagine maybe that they do. When we see that dogs love us, we wonder what's going on in their heads. And do they make meaning of their life based on us? What do they think about when they're laying there asleep on the floor? Or when we learn that geese mate for life, we wonder, what's their narrative? Do they have a story to tell? Or the fact that we can understand dolphins, or dolphins can understand each other. We wonder, do they think about us when they're swimming around? Or we've heard of the horse whisperer and the relationships of horses with people. And you think, what happens in the stable? There have been stories written about this, Or the fact that crows can remember particular faces, and so we wonder, do they talk about us when we're not around? We make meaning. I don't know, we don't know if other creatures make meaning, but we do. And it's by making meaning that we make sense of ourselves, and we make meaning through our relationships. It seems like the biggest challenge of this 2020 year is the challenge to make meaning of it. This is what sends us in a tailspin and keeps us up late at night as we try to make sense of what's going on and where we are in the midst of this. I've heard on numerous occasions people say to me, everything happens for a reason. And I want to say, well, what's the reason for this? Seems like we're able to say that statement after the fact. And the thing that I am annoyed by with that sentence is it makes it seem like we're just pawns in this for some grand scheme of a story or an experience. And I don't think we're that meaningless. The scriptures allow us to approach our life in a different way. They allow us to engage the moment and ask, where is God in this? The story of the Exodus seems to have illustrations about every human predicament there is. Time and again during this long journey, we see people and how they are and how they respond to one another. I was remembering in preparing for today about the book entitled Change or Die by Alan Dushman. Perhaps you remember that title. It came out a few years ago. It took the phrase that is common in business conversations and looked at it in a sociological landscape and found through some research that when people are given the options of change or inevitably a quicker death, that they usually don't change. This is a fascinating but true experience. I know I've seen it in my own life, either with myself or with people that I'm in relationship with. I think that this book, or this saying perhaps, change or die, forgets to acknowledge that every change is a little death. It means giving up something that's familiar and comfortable. Studies show that people will stick with dysfunction because it is familiar. We know about that in relationships. It baffles our minds when we see that happen time and again. But to change from dysfunction is work. And letting go of what's familiar and reaching for something new, especially when we're uncertain or especially when it requires our co-creation, we're not sure we want to do it. We don't like the challenge that offers. And so we usually just accept the way things are. It is what it is, people say. C'est la vie. What other languages have phrases like this? Do you think we just came up with these in the last century? I have a feeling there's a Hebrew saying back from the ancient times that would have said the same thing. Well, that's just how it is. Our text about the Exodus remind us of that inclination. I can't find a phrase that's repeated throughout there, but you see it in the sentiment and the attitudes of the people. When we read about the Exodus and all of the plagues, it was the first plague was that the water of the Nile was turned to blood. I'm sure that freaked everybody out. And they probably thought, what are we going to do? And then it went back to water and they said, oh, wow, that was freaky. And it just upped and upped and up. Frogs, golly, gnats and flies. This is annoying. Cattle plague. Oh my goodness. Boils. Well, it is what it is. Hail and thunderstorms, locusts eating plants. We adapt and we change. That's one of the best things about us. But sometimes we don't change in the ways that are needed. Our adaptability can become our Achilles heel, that we don't respond to the change that God is trying to bring about. The last plague before the one we read this morning is dense darkness. I'm thinking that the Hebrew people, when they were in Egypt, really had resigned themselves to this is just how it is. And each time along the way, they just adapted and dealt with it and really didn't do any of the hard work of what might be coming. But the last plague, the last one, the death of the firstborn, this was not one that they could take in stride. They couldn't say to this one, well, it is what it is. I've returned to this story of the Exodus time and again during this year of 2020. I'm struck by this coronavirus, COVID-19, which has not observed the boundaries that we had all constructed. What do you mean anybody can get it anyway? The first few months of learning of this virus, the first few months of this year, we were baffled and unsure of how it was spreading. And we would see it go in places that we didn't expect it to go, and it didn't observe the boundaries that we have constructed. I'm not saying, and please be clear that I want to make sure you know, I'm not saying that God caused COVID-19 as we read about the plagues in the Exodus. I'm not saying that. I don't need to understand why it is that we have COVID-19 to understand myself within it. The beauty of the scriptures is that it gives us a way to find ourselves in the midst of things we don't understand, because we get to read about people in scripture who are engaging things they don't understand. So time and again, we get to return and say what they do when they had no clue. And that's where I found the power of this story. I find myself trying to understand how to be human, how to live with my limited understanding in relationship to things which are beyond my understanding. I try to make sense of my finite self in a world that is infinite. Time and space is infinite, which is where God dwells, but my mind can't conceive that. So how do I live in this world? In the early months of this pandemic, we began to see disparities in our social network. We learned that pre-existing morbidities hastened people's submission and ultimate death from the coronavirus. I hadn't really thought about pre-morbidities before, pre-existing morbidities, such as cancer or chronic kidney disease or COPD or obesity or serious heart conditions or sickle cell disease or diabetes. I mean, we've been learning to live with this, and now all of a sudden we were learning that these were making people more vulnerable than we had initially thought. And we began to see that some people have more pre-existing morbidities than others, linked to stress. Stress is definitely linked to some of these developments of obesity or serious heart conditions. We know this from our studies. We know that there's stress associated with poverty. We know these things, that in poverty you don't take care of your health. You can't afford to. People don't eat right because healthy food is more expensive than junk food. People don't have time to exercise because there's too much work to be done just to live. Or the stress of making hard decisions, deciding whether or not you'll pay the electric bill or the water bill. Stress causes things in our bodies, and our bodies are susceptible to a virus. We also know that there's stress associated with the microaggressions of racism. When someone feels that their honesty is questioned because they're followed around a store, or someone takes a certain tone with them while asking questions, or simply gives them a look of scrutiny or distrust. Or maybe black folks feel the stress as a black parent of coaching your kid to not be mistaken for a thug or a thief, giving instructions such as don't wear a hoodie or keep your hands where the store clerk can see them at all times, things like that. There's even the stress of being perfect or exceptional in order to transcend one's questioning, so that when people challenge you, you can hold up your excellency. Now, not every black person has experienced all of these things, but I do know that every black person has experienced at least one of these things. And that is stressful. Stress makes our health vulnerable, and our vulnerability makes us susceptible to something like a virus. And in these early months of this year, when we were starting to notice the inequalities of this virus, somewhere around the end of April and the start of May, it was then that Ahmaud Arbery was shot while out for a run, and you know the rest of the story. The unfolding over these months of May, June, July, and August has revealed all kinds of things that for many of us white folks, we just didn't understand. When we have been in relationship with our black friends and relatives, now we say, oh, this is what you were talking about. This is what you meant. And we all know, my friends, that in the last 8 days alone, we've become aware of 3 people killed without any due process. One person was killed by a civilian, the other 2 were killed by law enforcement, and we are scratching our heads and barreling, folding over in weary and woe, saying, what happened? What happened to innocent and to proven guilty? What happened to this core value that we share as a people in our country? What has happened? That's what we're wondering. What is happening in our land? Something has got to change, but because we don't want death. We don't want last week to be a repeat or even to get worse. What kind of change is needed in our country? What kind of change in our communities can give us life? And this is where we go back to Scripture. And we see how challenging it is to accept a new way. We can see ourselves in the Hebrew people who longed for a new reality, and yet they clung to what was familiar, even when it wasn't life-giving, because they knew it. And we might want to say, as we read their stories, we might want to say, oh, I would never be like that. I would embrace life-giving change. I wouldn't be like those people. But my question has come from deep within me, and I ask it of you. Really? Really? Are you in that tiny percentage point of humanity that is eager for change or embraces change? Tell me how you do it. I'm in the majority. I'm in the majority that's nervous. I'm in the majority that if I'm not nervous, then maybe I'm unmotivated or maybe even lazy. Or maybe I'm in the majority that is nostalgic for an era that never existed. The book of Numbers, another book of the Pentateuch, tells the story of the Exodus, but tells it from a different perspective. The emphasis of Numbers is to remember the leadership of Moses. And I want to read to you a portion of this a passage from Numbers, chapter 11, where the Hebrew people are in the wilderness and they are lamenting out loud, complaining to Moses about the reality of being out here in the wilderness. This is what Numbers 11 says. The rabble among them had a strong craving. And the Israelites, the rabble was among the Israelites. The Israelites also wept again and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing. We remember cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. Numbers goes on to say, in this passage it reads, now the manna was like coriander seed, and its color was like the color of gum resin. The people went around and gathered it, ground it in mills or beat it in mortars, then boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell on the camp in the night, the manna would fall with it. Now, isn't it interesting, my friends? Isn't it interesting how people are? Here they are remembering the good taste, and oh my goodness, I love leeks and onions and garlic too. Cucumbers is a staple on our grocery list. Fish is something I thoroughly enjoy. Melons, well, I can take or leave those. But did they forget, the Israelites, that they were slaves in Egypt? Would they really trade in their freedom, as hard as it is to discover, just for food? Freedom is hard work, we are reminded. It requires us to navigate difficult conversations and situations. It takes time to listen and understand. Freedom requires patience and trust, even while it requires action and love. It requires forgiveness. Look at the instruction in Matthew's gospel for today, where Jesus is telling the disciples how to work through conflict. I read this step-by-step instructions and I say, ugh, I'd rather at times just cancel them, just unfriend them. But in the most extreme situation, we know that such actions as canceling and unfriending go all the way to getting rid of a person, ending their life. And we don't want that. We don't want that. And so we come back to Jesus' instructions to love one another. And that's hard too. But when we think about the extreme of loving one another, where does that lead us? Where does it lead us? Anybody have a guess where that leads us? It leads us to life. That's where it leads us. The Hebrew people, the Israelites, spent 40 years in the wilderness, a biblical number meant to express the fullness of time. They spent 40 years between a life of slavery to a life of remembering that God is their only master, that they are to love the Lord their God with their heart and their soul and their mind and their strength, and to love their neighbor as themselves. It took a long time. It took the fullness of time for them to get the hang of this message. And God kept them in the wilderness, our scriptures indicate, until they no longer longed for that which would actually kill them. That their craving wasn't for the riches that they had in bondage, but their craving was for God and the life of abundance that came with living as his children. Deuteronomy tells us of this story also, yet from a different perspective. In the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy, we hear Moses give his last speech. He's saying to the Israelite people, and I'm just picking up at the end of it here. He says, when all of these things have happened to you, the blessings and the curses that I have set before you, if you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, and you and your children obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, just as I am commanding you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, gathering you again from all the peoples among whom the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if you are exiled to the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you. And from there he will bring you back. The Lord your God will bring you into the land that your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, in order that you may live. The Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies and on the adversaries who took advantage of you. It's the Lord that will do that. Then you shall then again obey the Lord. And the Lord your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all your undertakings, in the fruit of your body, in the fruit of your livestock, and in the fruit of your soil. For the Lord will again take delight in prospering you, just as he delighted in prospering your ancestors. When you obey the Lord your God by observing his commandments and decrees that are written in this book of the law, because you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Surely this commandment that I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us, that we may hear it and observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it? No, the word is very near you. It's in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if you turn your hearts away and do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land of the Lord, the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. These were the last words that Moses spoke to the Hebrew people as we read about them in Deuteronomy. He was 120 years old. It goes on to say that he said to them, I'm not going to get to the promised land with you. You're going to go ahead without me. When I was doing a Google search about change or die prior to this sermon, came up with a link entitled 11 Powerful Quotes to Inspire Your Team to Embrace Change by Dave Kirpin. And so I scrolled through and read all 11. And at the conclusion, he adds a final thought, not numbered, just there at the bottom. He writes these words. Business author Alan Dushman popularized the business catchphrase, change or die. So I'll close with my own, more positive spin on this. Change or die? I'll choose life. How about you? We come full circle back to our scriptures that encourage us to choose life, to let God do the hard work of destroying the enemy as we do the hard work of loving one another. God promises us the evil will not go unpunished, but it's not our job to do the punishing. Our job is to work in love so that it reveals God's power and God can do the work that only God can do. Loving one another, it's hard work. It's daily practice. But it is the only thing that will take us out of bondage to the powers of this world into a new reality where we can live in peace. And so these words today remind us of ourselves. The scriptures call us to ourselves. We remember that Jesus said the two greatest commandments, he summed it up in one word, in one sentence. Love one another. That's our charge every day. And it is definitely enough work for every day. It calls us into prayer. It brings us to our knees. It teaches us humility and patience. It teaches us action and forgiveness. Thanks be to God for the Holy Scriptures that inform us of ourselves and that remind us of God's faithfulness to God's creation. Oh, that we might have ears to listen. Amen.